In the darkest hour of English history, when Viking longships blackened every river and hope seemed lost, one king would rise to forge a nation from the ashes of defeat. This is the story of Alfred the Great, the only English monarch to earn that title, and how he saved England from complete destruction. The year is 871 AD. For nearly a century, Viking raiders have terrorized the British Isles. What began as hit-and-run attacks has evolved into something far more sinister. Great heathen army, massive coalition of Norse warriors, has arrived not to raid, but to conquer and settle. The England we know today did not exist. Instead, 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms competed for supremacy in a land fractured by tribal warfare and religious division. The Romans had departed for centuries earlier, leaving behind roads, walls, and ruins, but no unified nation. Into this power vacuum came waves of Germanic settlers, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, who carved out their own territories and pushed the native Celtic Britons to the western fringes. By Alfred's birth in 849 AD, 3 kingdoms had already fallen to the Vikings. Northumbria, once the jewel of Christian learning, lay in ruins. East Anglia's last king, Edmund, had been captured and martyred in a ritual execution that would haunt Christian chronicles for centuries. Only Wessex, the kingdom of the West Saxons, stood as the final bulwark against total Viking domination. Alfred was never meant to be king. Born the youngest of 5 sons to King Athelwulf of Wessex, he seemed destined for a life in the church or as a minor royal advisor. Fate, however, had other plans. One by one, his older brothers died, some in battle, others from disease, until in 871 AD. At just 22 years old, Alfred inherited a kingdom on the brink of collapse. The challenges were overwhelming. The Viking Great Army, led by the formidable Ivar the Boneless and his brothers, had established a permanent base at York. They demanded tribute, hostages, and submission. Many Anglo-Saxon nobles advocated for surrender, viewing resistance as suicide. But Alfred possessed something his predecessors lacked: a strategic mind that could see beyond immediate defeat to long-term survival. The first years of Alfred's reign were marked by constant warfare and Pyrrhic victories. At the Battle of Ashdown in 871, Alfred achieved a crucial victory against the Vikings, but it came at enormous cost. His forces were depleted, his treasury empty, and more Viking reinforcements arrived each spring. By 878 AD, the situation had become desperate. In the dead of winter, 878 AD, disaster struck. A surprise Viking assault led by Guthrum overran Wessex's defenses. Alfred's court scattered, his nobles fled, and the king himself was forced to retreat to the Somerset marshes with only a handful of loyal followers. For months, the future savior of England lived as a fugitive in the swamplands. Reduced to raiding Viking supply lines and hiding in peasant hovels, it was during this lowest point that the famous legend of Alfred burning the cakes emerged. Whether true or mythical, the story captured a profound truth: even kings must learn humility before they can achieve greatness. In the Somerset marshes, Alfred underwent a transformation from privileged royal to battle-hardened leader who understood his people's suffering firsthand. But Alfred was not merely hiding, he was planning. Through a network of loyal thanes and common soldiers, he began to rebuild his forces. His message was simple but powerful. This was not just a war between kingdoms, but a struggle for the survival of Christian Anglo-Saxon civilization against pagan conquerors. In May 878 AD, Alfred emerged from the marshes with a reformed army. At Edington, in what would become one of the most decisive battles in English history, he confronted Guthrum's host. The battle raged for hours, Saxon shield wall against Viking berserkers, the future of a nation hanging in the balance. Alfred's victory at Edington was total. Guthrum's army was shattered. The Viking leader captured, and for the first time in decades, the invaders sued for peace. But Alfred's masterstroke was not military, it was diplomatic. Rather than execute Guthrum, he offered him baptism and a treaty that would reshape England forever. The Treaty of Wedmore established the Danelaw Northern and Eastern Territory, where Vikings could settle peacefully under their own laws. While Alfred retained control of Wessex and much of Mercia, this wasn't surrender writ, was strategic genius. by giving the Vikings what they wanted most: land to farm rather than raid. Alfred bought time to rebuild and innovate. Victory in battle made Alfred a hero, but his reforms made him great, recognizing that military success alone could not preserve his kingdom. He embarked on a revolutionary transformation of Anglo-Saxon society. He established a network of fortified towns called burhs, strategically placed so that no settlement was more than 20 miles from defensive walls. But Alfred's greatest innovation was educational. Lamenting that learning had declined so severely that few could read Latin, he initiated a program of translation that brought classical and Christian texts into the vernacular. He personally translated works by Boethius, Augustine, and Gregory the Great, establishing English as a language of literature and learning. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, begun during Alfred's reign, became the foundation of English historical writing. For the first time, a Germanic people had a systematic record of their own history, written in their own language. This wasn't just scholarship, it was nation-building through narrative. By his death in 899 AD, Alfred had transformed Wessex from a struggling kingdom into the foundation of England. His legal code, the Doom Book, established principles of justice that would influence English law for centuries. Educational reforms created a literate class that could administer an increasingly complex state. Alfred the Great died knowing he had saved his people, but he could not have imagined how completely his vision would triumph. The England he preserved would grow into a maritime empire, the birthplace of parliamentary democracy, and a force that would shape the modern world. But that transformation began here in the Somerset Marshes. With one king who refused to surrender when surrender seemed the only option, the death of Alfred the Great in 899 AD marked not an ending, but a beginning. His son Edward the Elder inherited more than a crown. He inherited a vision of England that would transform a collection of warring kingdoms into a unified nation. But first, he would face the greatest challenge to his father's legacy: a Viking resurgence that threatened to undo everything Alfred had built. The peace established by the Treaty of Wedmore had lasted barely 2 decades when new Viking armies began arriving from across the North Sea. These were not the raiders of old, but professional warriors seeking permanent conquest. They found willing allies among the Danish settlers of the Danelaw, who had grown restless under the uneasy peace with Wessex. Edward's response was swift and decisive. Unlike his father, who had been forced to react to Viking aggression, Edward took the offensive. He launched a systematic campaign to reclaim the Danelaw, fortifying captured towns and establishing English rule over territories that had been lost for generations. His strategy was methodically advance: fortify, consolidate, repeat. The key to Edward's success was his partnership with his remarkable sister, Telfuld, Lady of the Mercia. While Edward pressed north and east, Telfuld secured the western flank, building fortresses and commanding armies with a skill that rivaled any king. Together, the siblings created a pincer movement that gradually squeezed Viking resistance from both sides. By 918 AD, the Danelaw was crumbling. Town after town fell to Edward's methodical advance. The Vikings, once masters of swift movement and surprise attack, found themselves trapped in a war of attrition against an enemy that had learned their lessons well. The English had become what the Vikings had always been: professional warriors fighting for survival. But Edward's greatest triumph was not military, it was political. As he conquered Danish territories, he did not simply impose West Saxon rule. Instead, he offered the Danish settlers a choice: accept English overlordship and keep their lands, or face exile. Most chose accommodation, beginning the slow process of cultural integration that would transform England from a collection of ethnic enclaves into a unified people. The death of Telfuld in 918 AD marked the end of Mercia as an independent kingdom. Edward moved swiftly to claim his sister's territory. For the first time since the Roman departure, a single ruler controlled England south of the Humber. The dream of unity that had sustained Alfred through his darkest hours was becoming reality. Edward's son, Aethelstan, would complete what his grandfather had begun. Crowned in 925 AD, Aethelstan was the first king to style himself King of the English rather than merely King of the West Saxons. This was not empty boastfulness. It reflected a new reality. England was no longer a geographic expression, but a political entity with defined borders and a single ruler. The proof of this unity came in 937 AD at the Battle of Brunanburh, where Alfred faced a coalition of Vikings, Scots, and Welsh determined to reverse English expansion. The battle was a slaughter. Athelstan's victory was so complete that it established English dominance over the entire British Isles for the first time in history. But even as England achieved unprecedented unity, new challenges emerged. The Vikings were not finished. In 991 AD, a new generation of Norse warriors, led by the legendary Olaf Tryggvason, began launching devastating raids against English coastal towns. These attacks revealed a troubling truth: the England that Alfred had saved and his successors had unified was growing soft. The response of King Tellard the Unready to these new Viking attacks would prove disastrous. Rather than fight, he chose to pay tribute, the infamous Danegeld. What began as a temporary expedient became a permanent humiliation. Each payment only encouraged more attacks, as Viking leaders realized they could extract enormous wealth without the risks of conquest. The policy of appeasement reached its logical conclusion in 1013 AD, when the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard invaded England, not to raid, but to rule. The Thellard fled to Normandy, and for the first time since Alfred's victory at Edington, England was ruled by a Viking king. The wheel of history had come full circle. Sweyn's death in 1014 AD provided a brief respite, but his son Canute proved even more formidable. Young, ambitious, and utterly ruthless, Canute conquered England not through a single decisive battle, through a campaign of systematic terror that broke English resistance completely. By 1016 AD, the House of Wessex was extinct, and England was ruled by a Danish dynasty. Yet Sianut's reign would prove one of the most transformative in English history. Rather than govern England as a conquered territory, he embraced his new role as an English king. He married into the old royal family, adopted English customs, and ruled through existing institutions. The Viking who had destroyed the House of Wessex became its unlikely heir. Under Sianut's rule, England experienced a golden age of prosperity and cultural achievement. Trade flourished, monasteries were rebuilt, and the arts patronized. The country that had once trembled before Viking raiders now stood as the center of a North Sea empire that included Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden. But Sianut's empire was built on the foundation of a single man's ability, and when he died in 1035 AD, it began to crumble immediately. His sons lacked his political skill and personal charisma. England, which had seemed permanently absorbed into a Scandinavian empire, suddenly found itself free to choose its own destiny once again. The choice fell to Edward the Confessor, son of the discredited Thelard, but heir to the ancient royal line of Wessex. His coronation in 1042 AD marked the restoration of English rule, but it also revealed how much the country had changed. The England that Edward inherited was no longer the isolated kingdom that Alfred had saved. It was a European power with complex relationships across the continent. Edward's reign would be marked by peace and prosperity, but also by a growing tension that would ultimately destroy the England he ruled. Having spent his youth in Norman exile, Edward favored Norman advisors and Norman customs. This preference gradually alienated the English nobility, creating the conditions for the crisis that would define his successor. The crisis came to a head in 1051 AD, when Edward attempted to appoint a Norman archbishop to Canterbury. The English nobility, led by the powerful Earl Godwin of Wessex, rose in rebellion. The confrontation that followed revealed the fundamental weakness of Edward's position. He was an English king who had lost touch with his English subjects. The resolution of this crisis set the stage for the Norman conquest itself. Edward, forced to compromise with his rebellious nobles, found himself increasingly dependent on Earl Godwin's family. When Godwin died in 1053 AD, his son Harold inherited not just his father's title, but his dominant position in English politics.
The year 1066 would become the most famous date in English history, but the crisis that led to the Norman conquest began years earlier with a deathbed promise that would change the world. In January 1066, Edward the Confessor lay dying in his newly built Westminster Abbey, and the question of succession hung over England like a storm cloud ready to break. Edward had ruled for 24 years without producing an heir, and his death would trigger the most contested succession in medieval history. 3 men would claim the English throne, each with seemingly legitimate grounds, and their competing ambitions would drench England in blood and forever alter the trajectory of European civilization. The first claimant was Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex, and the most powerful nobleman in England. Harold had effectively governed the kingdom during Edward's final years, leading armies, conducting diplomacy, and commanding the loyalty of the English nobility. On his deathbed, Edward allegedly named Harold as his successor, and the wit in the Council of English Nobles immediately confirmed this choice. But across the English Channel, William, Duke of Normandy, prepared for war. William claimed that Edward had promised him the throne years earlier during his exile in Normandy, and that Harold himself had sworn a sacred oath to support this claim during a mysterious visit to Normandy in 1064. Whether these claims were true or fabricated, William believed them with the fervour of a religious crusade. The third claimant came from an unexpected quarter, Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, and perhaps the most feared warrior in Europe. Hardrada based his claim on an obscure treaty between his predecessor and Canute's sons, arguing that he was the rightful heir to Canute's English kingdom. To most observers, this seemed the weakest claim of all, but Hardrada commanded an army of Vikings who cared little for legal niceties. Harold Godwinson's coronation on January 6, 1066, the very day of Edward's funeral, demonstrated his determination to present a fait accompli to his rivals. But the speed of his crowning also revealed his vulnerability. A legitimate king should not need to seize power so hastily. The die was cast, and England braced for invasion. William's preparations were meticulous. He spent months building ships, gathering supplies, and recruiting knights from across northern France. Most importantly, he secured papal blessing for his expedition, transforming what might have been seen as naked aggression into a holy war against a perjured usurper. The papal banner that would fly over William's army at Hastings represented a revolution in medieval warfare, the Church's explicit endorsement of conquest. Meanwhile, Harold faced an impossible strategic situation. He had to defend against invasion from 2 directions, William as Normans to the south and Hardrada as Vikings to the north, while maintaining an army that was essentially a militia called up for limited service. As spring turned to summer with no sign of invasion, Harold's forces began to disperse to bring in the harvest. The first blow came not from Normandy but from Norway. In September 1066, Harold Hardrada's fleet appeared in the Humber estuary with 300 ships carrying perhaps 15,000 warriors. This was not a raid but a full-scale invasion, and it caught northern England completely unprepared. The invaders advanced up the Ouse River toward York, the ancient capital of Northumbria. At Fulford Gate, outside York, Hardrada met the local earls Edwin and Morcar in battle. The English fought bravely, but were overwhelmed by the sheer ferocity of the Viking assault. The last great Viking army had announced its arrival with a victory that echoed the conquests of the great heathen army 2 centuries earlier. Harold's response demonstrated the strategic brilliance that had made him the dominant figure in English politics. In just 4 days, he marched his army 180 miles north, a logistical feat that shocked his enemies and inspired his followers. The English arrived at Stamford Bridge on September 25th to find the Vikings scattered across both sides of the river. Derwent, many without armor in the warm autumn sun. The Battle of Stamford Bridge was a slaughter that effectively ended the Viking Age. Hardrada himself fell early in the fighting, struck down by an English arrow. The great warrior who had dominated battlefields from Sicily to the Arctic Ocean died in a muddy Yorkshire field, his dreams of empire dying with him. Of the 300 ships that had brought his army to England, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. But Harold's triumph carried the seeds of his destruction. While he celebrated victory in Yorkshire, William's invasion fleet had finally sailed from Normandy. On September 28th, just 3 days after Stamford Bridge, Norman ships beached at Pevensey on the Sussex coast. William had landed in England with perhaps 8,000 men, knights, infantry, and archers, and immediately began fortifying his position. Harold received news of the Norman landing while still in the north, and once again demonstrated his remarkable energy. He force-marched his army south, covering 250 miles in just 2 weeks while gathering reinforcements along the way. But the army that assembled on Senlac Hill outside Hastings on October 14th was exhausted from constant marching and depleted by casualties from Stamford Bridge. The Battle of Hastings would be decided not by grand strategy, but by tactical innovation and sheer endurance. Harold's English army formed a shield wall across the hilltop, their great axes and spears creating an almost impenetrable barrier. For hours, William's knights charged uphill against this wall, only to be held back with terrible losses. The turning point came when a rumor spread that William had been killed. As panic began to grip the Norman ranks, William dramatically removed his helmet and rode before his troops, proving he lived. This moment of leadership steadied his army and allowed him to attempt a desperate stratagem of feigned retreat that lured part of the English line down the hill. As the English pursuit broke formation, Norman cavalry wheeled and struck. The careful discipline that had held Harold's line all day began to crumble. Fighting raged through the afternoon, but gradually the Normans gained ground. As darkness approached, Harold himself fell, struck down near his royal standard after fighting for nearly 10 hours. With their king dead and their army shattered, English resistance collapsed. The survivors fled into the gathering darkness, and William, Duke of Normandy, became William the Conqueror. The England that Alfred had saved, that Edward and Thelstan had unified, and that had survived Danish conquest and Viking resurgence, had finally fallen to a new kind of invader, one who came not to raid or rule temporarily, but to transform. The Norman conquest represented more than a change of dynasty. It marked the end of Anglo-Saxon England and the beginning of a new chapter in which England would be drawn inexorably into the broader currents of European politics and culture. The language, law, architecture, and very identity of England would be transformed by this single day as fighting on a hillside in Sussex. Yet even in defeat, the seeds of England's future greatness were being planted. The fusion of Norman efficiency with Anglo-Saxon traditions would create something unprecedented, a kingdom that combined the best of both worlds, and would soon emerge as the dominant power in the British Isles and eventually far beyond.
The morning after Hastings, William the Conqueror stood among the corpses of English nobility and faced a sobering reality: winning a battle was not the same as conquering a kingdom. Ahead lay the mammoth task of subduing a hostile population, establishing control over vast territories, and transforming England from an Anglo-Saxon realm into a Norman dominion. William's first challenge was legitimacy. Despite his military victory, he remained a foreign invader to most English people. His solution was characteristically Norman, a blend of legal formalism and brutal pragmatism. Claimed to be Edward, the Confessor's rightful heir, not a conqueror, but a king, reclaiming his inheritance from a usurper. This fiction would prove essential to Norman rule. The march to London revealed the fragility of William's position. Though no army dared face him in open battle, the English refused to submit. Town after town closed its gates, forcing the Normans to take a circuitous route through Kent and Surrey, burning and pillaging as they went. This devastation was not mindless cruelty, but calculated terror. William was teaching England the price of resistance. The submission of London in December 1066 marked a turning point. The surviving English nobles, seeing no alternative to Norman rule, offered William the crown. His coronation on Christmas Day in Westminster Abbey was carefully choreographed to suggest continuity with the Anglo-Saxon past. But the nervous Norman guards outside, mistaking the congregation's ritual acclamations for rebellion, set fire to nearby buildings. Even in triumph, the Normans revealed their fundamental insecurity. William's early policies showed remarkable restraint. Rather than replacing the entire English nobility, initially confirmed many in their positions, hoping to govern through existing structures. English law remained largely intact, and Anglo-Saxon administrative practices continued. This moderation reflected not mercy, but necessity. William lacked the manpower to impose Norman customs everywhere at once. But this accommodation was temporary. When English nobles proved unreliable, plotting rebellion and fleeing to foreign courts, William's patience ended. The Great Rebellion of 1069, supported by a Danish invasion, marked the end of his conciliatory phase. The king who had once promised to rule as an English monarch now revealed himself as a Norman conqueror determined to break English resistance forever. The harrying of the North in 1069–70 became one of the most devastating campaigns in English history. William's armies swept through Yorkshire, Durham, and surrounding counties, systematically destroying crops, livestock, villages, and anything that could support human life. Chroniclers recorded that for generations afterward, much of northern England remained a wasteland where wolves outnumbered people. This scorched earth campaign achieved its objective. Never again would northern England rebel against Norman rule. But the cost was enormous, not just in human suffering but in economic productivity. The Domesday Book, compiled 20 years later, still recorded vast areas as waste, testament to the thoroughness of William's retribution. With resistance crushed, William embarked on the systematic transformation of English society. The Old English nobility was virtually exterminated, killed in battle, executed for treason, or driven into exile. In their place came Norman and French knights, rewarded with confiscated lands and charged with maintaining order in their new territories. This land redistribution was the most comprehensive in European history. By 1086, less than 5% of English land remained in Anglo-Saxon hands. Every major estate, every important manor, had passed to Norman control. This wasn't mere conquest, but replacement on entire ruling class, erased and substituted with foreign overlords. The architectural transformation of England reflected this social revolution. Anglo-Saxon wooden halls gave way to Norman stone keeps, their massive walls and defensive towers proclaiming the power of the new rulers. Canterbury Cathedral, Winchester Castle, the Tower of London, these monuments to Norman dominance rose across England like granite declarations of permanent occupation. But the Normans brought more than military might and architectural ambition. They carried with them the administrative genius that had made Normandy the most efficiently governed territory in Europe. The English system of local courts and customary law was overlaid with Norman innovation's systematic record-keeping, standardized procedures, and centralized authority that reached into every village and hamlet. The compilation of the Domesday Book in 1086 exemplified this administrative revolution. Never before had any European kingdom attempted such a comprehensive survey of its resources. Every hide of land, every ox, every silver penny was recorded with Germanic thoroughness applied through Norman organization. The survey took just 2 years to complete, a logistical achievement that demonstrated the efficiency of Norman government. Yet for all their innovations, the Normans faced an unexpected challenge: the resilience of English culture. While they could confiscate lands and build castles, they could not eradicate 1,000 years of Anglo-Saxon tradition. The English language survived in villages and markets. English customs persisted in local communities, and English Christianity adapted rather than disappeared. This cultural persistence forced a gradual accommodation between conqueror and conquered. Norman knights, who married English heiresses, found themselves adopting English names for their children. French priests ministering to English congregations learned Anglo-Saxon hymns. By the end of William's reign, a new synthesis was emerging, neither purely Norman nor purely English, but something unprecedented. The death of William the Conqueror in 1087 marked the end of the conquest phase and the beginning of consolidation. His son William Rufus inherited England, while his eldest son Robert received Normandy. This division of the conquest inheritance would create decades of conflict as successive rulers attempted to reunite William's empire. But the fundamental transformation was complete. The England that emerged from Norman rule was unrecognizable from the Anglo-Saxon kingdom that had fallen at Hastings. A new aristocracy spoke French, a new architecture dominated the landscape, and a new legal system governed daily life. Yet beneath these changes, the essential character of England endured: pragmatic, adaptable, and remarkably persistent. The Norman conquest had not destroyed England, but transformed it. The kingdom that would emerge from this traumatic rebirth would combine Norman organizational skills with English resilience, creating a hybrid that was stronger than either parent culture alone. Within generations, the descendants of conquerors and conquered would think of themselves not as Normans or Anglo-Saxons, but simply as English and new people forged from the fusion of two worlds. After dominating England for decades, William the Conqueror died in 1087, before kicking the bucket. He decided to divide his inheritance among his 3 sons, giving Normandy to his eldest, Robert, and England to his second, William Rufus. The only problem with this arrangement was that it violated the fundamental principle that had made the conquest possible, namely that England and Normandy could only be ruled by a single, undisputed leader. And thus the seeds of discontent were sown, which would soon grow into a massive harvest of civil war. We're going to look at how the death of William the Conqueror tore his empire apart and set the stage for the English Civil War. William Rufus inherited his father's ruthlessness, but lacked his political wisdom. Known for his violent temper, his contempt for the church, and his apparent lack of interest in marriage or producing heirs, Rufus ruled England with an iron fist that grew heavier with each passing year. His court became notorious for its extravagance and moral corruption, shocking even the hardened Norman nobility. The new king's relationship with the church quickly deteriorated. When Archbishop Lanfranc died in 1089, Rufus deliberately left the See of Canterbury vacant for 4 years, confiscating its revenues for the royal treasury. This was not merely greed, but a systematic assault on the independence of the English Church that would have profound consequences for the development of English constitutional law. Meanwhile, across the Channel, Duke Robert proved equally inadequate to the challenges of rule. Where Rufus was too harsh, Robert was too weak. His inability to control his barons or defend his borders invited intervention from both his brothers, William from England and Henry from his small lordship in western Normandy. The unity that William the Conqueror had forged was dissolving into fraternal warfare. In 1093, Rufus fell seriously ill and, fearing divine retribution, appointed Anselm as Archbishop of Canterbury. Once recovered, the king immediately regretted this decision. Anselm, one of the great theological minds of his age, proved an implacable opponent of royal interference in church affairs. Their conflict would rage for the rest of Rufus's reign and beyond. The death of William Rufus in 1100 remains one of history's great mysteries. According to the chroniclers, the king was killed by an arrow while hunting in the New Forest. But modern historians debate the circumstances of his demise. Was it accident, suicide, or murder at the hands of his own brother? What is certain, however, is that Rufus's death cleared the way for the youngest brother, Henry, to seize the English throne with remarkable speed. Henry was in the hunting party that day, yet somehow reached Winchester, where the royal treasury was kept, before news of his brother's death had spread. He placed loyal supporters in key positions, summoned the English barons to meet him at Winchester, and crowned himself king in a ceremony that was rushed, not because of any lack of ceremony, but because Henry wanted to reach London before anyone else heard of his accession. Henry's coronation charter promised to restore the good laws of Edward the Confessor and end the abuses of his brother's reign. This document, though largely propaganda, established crucial precedents for limiting royal power. For the first time since the Conquest, an English king acknowledged that his authority was not absolute, but bounded by law and custom. Henry's marriage to Matilda, descendant of the old Anglo-Saxon royal line, was a masterstroke of political reconciliation. Their union symbolically reunited the Norman and English bloodlines, creating a new dynasty that could claim legitimacy through both conquest and inheritance. The children of this marriage would embody the fusion of two peoples that had been slowly developing since 1066, but Henry's greatest challenge lay across the Channel. Duke Robert had returned from the First Crusade in 1100 laden with glory and military prestige, and his inability to control his barons or defend his borders invited intervention from both his brothers William from England and Henriette from his small lordship in western Normandy. The Battle of Tinchebray in 1106 was as decisive as Hastings 40 years earlier. Henry's victory over Robert reunited England and Normandy under a single ruler. But it also established the principle that England, not Normandy, was the senior partner in this relationship. The Norman conquest had become an English empire stretching across the Channel. Henry's administrative reforms transformed English government from a personal monarchy into an institutional state. The Exchequer, established around 1110, created the first systematic method of royal accounting in European history. Twice yearly, sheriffs from across England gathered at Westminster to render account of their revenues on a checkered cloth that gave the institution its name. This innovation allowed the king to keep track of his finances, but it also freed royal officials from the constant demands of the nobility, had previously used their influence to extract money from local officials. The development of royal justice under Henry I marked another crucial evolution. Instead of relying solely on local courts dominated by Norman barons, Henry sent royal justices throughout England to hear cases in the king's name. This innovation, expanded by his successors, would eventually create a common law that applied to all of England, Norman and English alike. But Henry's reign also revealed the fundamental weakness of medieval monarchy, the succession problem. The only legitimate son, William Atheling, drowned in the White Ship disaster of 1120, leaving Henry with only a daughter, Matilda, as his heir. In a society that had never accepted female rule, this created a constitutional crisis that would tear England apart for 2 decades. Henry's decision to name Matilda as his successor and force his barons to swear allegiance to her was revolutionary. But it was also pragmatic. Matilda had married Geoffrey of Anjou, creating an alliance that would protect the Anglo-Norman realm from French aggression. Yet many nobles, having sworn the oath reluctantly, began planning alternatives the moment Henry died. The death of Henry I in 1135 triggered exactly the succession crisis he had tried to prevent. Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew, seized the throne with the support of his brother, the powerful Bishop of Winchester, and the London citizenry. His coronation was swift and seemingly decisive, but it was also legally questionable. Stephen had broken his oath to support Matilda's claim. Matilda's invasion of England in 1139 began the period known as the Anarchy of Civil War that would devastate the kingdom for nearly 20 years. This was not merely a dynastic struggle, but a fundamental contest over the nature of royal authority. Stephen represented the old principle of male succession and aristocratic consent, while Matilda embodied the new idea of hereditary right regardless of gender. The warfare that followed was particularly destructive because both sides possessed legitimate claims to royal authority. Barons could switch sides without appearing treasonous, and many did so repeatedly as military fortunes changed. England became a patchwork of competing jurisdictions, where royal writs carried no weight and local strongmen imposed their own law. The siege of Oxford Castle in 1142 epitomized both the drama and futility of the conflict. Matilda, trapped in the castle through a harsh winter, escaped across the frozen Thames dressed in white robes for camouflage. Her dramatic flight became legendary, but it also symbolized the elusive nature of victory in this civil war. Dramatic gestures could not resolve fundamental questions of legitimacy. By the 1140s, both sides were exhausted. Stephen controlled most of England, but could not eliminate Matilda's supporters. Matilda held the West Country, but could not break Stephen's hold on London and the southeast. The stalemate was killing the kingdom, destroying the administrative achievements of Henry I and reducing England to the feudal anarchy that the Norman Conquest had originally ended. The resolution came through compromise and generational change. Matilda's son Henry, born in 1133, had grown up during the Civil War and understood its futility. When he inherited his father's Angevin lands in 1151, he possessed resources that dwarfed those available to either Stephen or Matilda. The young man who would become Henry II represented not just a new claimant, but a new kind of ruler, one whose power base lay not in England or Normandy alone, but in a vast continental empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, check out our podcast, available on various platforms. Thanks. In 1154, 21-year-old Dynamo ascended the English throne and changed the course of European history. Henry II was not merely a king, but an emperor, in all but name, ruler of an Angevin empire that stretched from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees. His coronation marked the end of the anarchy and the beginning of the most transformative reign in medieval English history. Henry's inheritance was staggering in its scope. From his mother Matilda, he claimed England and Normandy. From his father Geoffrey, he inherited Anjou and Maine. Through his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, he controlled more of France than the French king himself. This Angevin empire was the largest European state since Charlemagne, and Henry ruled it with an energy that exhausted his contemporaries. The young king's first task was restoring order to England after 20 years of civil war. Castles built without royal permission during the anarchy were systematically destroyed. Foreign mercenaries were expelled. Most importantly, Henry revived and expanded the administrative machinery that his grandfather Henry I had created, transforming England into the most efficiently governed kingdom in Europe. The Assize of Clarendon in 1166 revolutionized English justice by establishing a system of royal courts with standardized procedures. For the first time, the same law applied whether a man lived in Yorkshire or Devon. This common law, administered by professional judges rather than local nobles, created a unified legal culture that bound England together more effectively than any military conquest. Henry's innovations extended beyond law to military organization. The Assize of Arms required every freeman to possess weapons. appropriate to his station, and serve in the militia when called upon. This system created the most effective military force in Europe, not a feudal army dependent on aristocratic cooperation, but a royal army answerable only to the crown. But Henry's greatest challenge came from an unexpected quarter, his former friend and chancellor, Thomas Becket, whom he had appointed Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162. Henry expected Becket to support royal interests against the church. But the worldly politician underwent a dramatic transformation upon becoming archbishop, emerging as an uncompromising defender of ecclesiastical independence. The conflict between king and archbishop escalated over the constitutions of Clarendon in 1164, which attempted to restore the relationship between church and state that had existed before the Civil War. Becket's refusal to accept these provisions led to his exile in France, and a 6-year struggle that divided Europe between supporters of royal authority and defenders of church freedom. The murder of Thomas Becket in Canterbury Cathedral on December 29, 1170, became one of the defining moments of medieval history. Whether Henry's angry words, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" were meant as a command or merely an expression of frustration, 4 knights took them literally and butchered the archbishop at the altar of his own cathedral. The immediate aftermath was catastrophic for Henry. Becket's martyrdom created a saint whose cult spread across Europe. While the king faced excommunication and the threat of crusade against his lands, Henry's dramatic penance at Canterbury in 1174. Walking barefoot through the streets and submitting to scourging by the cathedral monks was both genuine remorse and brilliant political theater. The Becket crisis revealed the fundamental tension in Henry's empire between centralized authority and traditional privileges. While he successfully subordinated the English nobility to royal will, the church retained international connections that made it impossible to control completely. This lesson would influence English constitutional development for centuries. Henry's domestic achievements were matched by his military successes. The conquest of Ireland, begun in 1169, brought the Celtic island under English influence for the first time since the Roman withdrawal. Though incomplete, this intervention established the English presence in Ireland that would dominate the island's history for 800 years. The king's relationship with his family proved more challenging than governing his empire. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most remarkable women of the Middle Ages, chafed under Henry's authoritarian rule and his flagrant infidelity. Their sons, Henry the young king, Richard Geoffrey, and John, inherited their parents' intelligence and ambition, but also their capacity for ruthless calculation. The Great Revolt of 1173-74 saw Louis's wife and 3 eldest sons ally with Louis VII of France in an attempt to partition the Angevin Empire. The rebellion failed, but it established a pattern of family warfare that would plague Henry's later years. The king, who could subdue nobles and churchmen, could not control his own household. Eleanor's imprisonment after the revolt marked the beginning of Henry's decline. Without her counsel and administrative skill, the empire became increasingly difficult to manage. The king's energy, once legendary, began to flag under the constant pressure of governing territories that required him to be in multiple places simultaneously. The king's attempts to ensure peaceful succession only created more conflict. His decision to crown his eldest son Henry as co-king in 1170 had intended to establish clear succession, but the young king's death in 1183 left the inheritance unclear. Richard and John began maneuvering against each other while their father still lived, each seeking allies and advantages for the coming struggle. Henry's final years were marked by increasing isolation and bitterness. His sons showed him no loyalty, his nobles grew restive under his authoritarian rule, and his health deteriorated from a lifetime of constant travel and stress. The king, who had once controlled half of France, found himself fighting desperately to preserve any part of his inheritance. The end came suddenly in 1189. Richard allied with Philip Augustus of France in a final rebellion that proved too much for the aging king. Henry's last words reportedly expressed his bitter disappointment with his sons. Shame, shame on a conquered king. His death marked not just the end of a reign, but the beginning of the end for the Angevin Empire. Yet Henry II's legacy was transformative. He had created the administrative and legal foundations of the modern English state. His legal reforms established principles of common law that would influence legal systems worldwide. His military innovations proved the effectiveness of royal authority over feudal fragmentation. Most importantly, Henry had established England as a European power. It's no longer a peripheral kingdom vulnerable to every continental upheaval. England under Henry commanded respect and fear from Scotland to Spain. The Angevin Empire might not survive, but the English state that emerged from it would be strong enough to pursue its own imperial destiny. The crown that passed to Richard the Lionheart in 1189 carried with it the most sophisticated governmental machinery in Europe and the most powerful military force. Richard would use these tools not to consolidate his father's achievements, but to pursue glory in the Holy Land, beginning a new chapter in which England as kings would seek fame and fortune far from their island realm. The coronation of Richard the Lionheart in September 1189 marked the beginning of one of the most paradoxical reigns in English history. Here was a king who would become England's greatest medieval hero, yet spent only 6 months of his 10-year reign in the country he ruled. Richard's obsession with crusade and glory would drain England's treasury, neglect its government, and ultimately cost him his life. Yet his legend would inspire English kings for centuries. Richard's preparation for the Third Crusade consumed England's resources with breathtaking efficiency. He famously declared he would sell London itself if he could find a buyer. Royal lands, offices, and privileges were auctioned to the highest bidders. Even the Kingdom of Scotland was essentially sold back to William the Lion for 10,000 marks. England became a vast fundraising operation for Holy War. The decision to join Philip Augustus of France on crusade represented both the pinnacle and the beginning of the end of the Angevin alliance with France. These two kings, who had recently fought together against Richard's father, now embarked on the greatest military adventure of the age as partners. Yet their rivalry would prove more destructive than their cooperation was beneficial. Richard's departure for the Holy Land in 1190 left England in the hands of his chancellor, William Longchamp, whose arrogance and heavy-handed rule soon provoked rebellion. The king's brother John, left behind with carefully limited authority, began asserting claims that went far beyond his official position. England's most absent king had inadvertently created the conditions for civil war. The Third Crusade showcased Richard's military genius and established his reputation as the greatest warrior of his age. At Acre, his siege engines breached walls that had resisted Saladin for 2 years. At Arsef, his tactical brilliance routed a Muslim army that had seemed invincible. Yet for all his victories, Richard could not recapture Jerusalem. The ultimate goal remained tantalizingly out of reach. The relationship between Richard and Saladin became the stuff of legend too. Noble enemies who respected each other across the divide of religion and culture. Their diplomatic exchanges revealed a level of mutual understanding that was rare in an age of religious fanaticism. When Richard fell ill, Saladin sent his personal physician. When Saladin's horse was killed in battle, Richard sent replacement mounts. But even as Richard won glory in the Holy Land, his empire was crumbling. Philip Augustus had returned to France and begun systematically attacking Angevin territories. John's machinations in England grew bolder, and rumors spread that Richard was dead. The kingdom that Henry II had built through decades of careful administration was being destroyed by his son's neglect. Richard's capture by Duke Leopold of Austria while returning from crusade in 1192 transformed a political crisis into a constitutional revolution. With the king imprisoned and demanding an enormous ransom, England faced its first real test of government without royal presence. The Regency Council, led by the justiciar Hubert Walter, proved that Henry II's administrative machinery could function even without the monarch. The collection of Richard's ransom, 150,000 marks, equivalent to several years' royal revenue, demonstrated both England's wealth and the effectiveness of its government. Every church contributed its silver, every noble paid extraordinary taxes, and the Cistercian monastery surrendered a year's wool crop. Never before had a European kingdom mobilized its resources so completely for a single purpose. John's attempt to prevent Richard's return by allying with Philip Augustus revealed the fundamental weakness of the Angevin system. The empire was too large and too diverse to survive the prolonged absence of its ruler, while Richard fought for Jerusalem. The foundations of his power were being systematically undermined by his brother and his rival. Richard's return to England in 1194 lasted just 2 months, but it was sufficient to reassert royal authority and pardon most of his brother's supporters. The king's clemency toward John, whom he famously dismissed as a child who had been led astray by evil counselors, showed remarkable political wisdom. But it also stored up trouble for the future. The last 5 years of Richard's reign were spent in constant warfare with Philip Augustus over the Angevin territories in France. The construction of Chateau Galliard, Richard's saucy castle overlooking the Seine, epitomized his strategy of defensive warfare combined with offensive architecture. This magnificent fortress was designed to protect Normandy and serve as a base for reconquering lost territories. But Richard's military obsessions came at enormous cost. England was taxed more heavily than ever before to fund campaigns that brought no tangible benefit to the kingdom. The prosperity that had characterized Henry II's reign gave way to financial exhaustion. As every resource was squeezed to support Richard's continental wars, the siege of Chalais-Charbral in 1199 seemed like a minor operation, a small castle holding out against royal authority over a disputed treasure trove. But this petty siege would claim the life of the greatest warrior king of his age. Richard's death from an infected crossbow wound represented a catastrophic failure of judgment the Lionheart had exposed himself unnecessarily to achieve a trivial objective. Richard's deathbed recognition of John as his heir was perhaps his final disservice to England. The kingdom that passed to John in 1199 was financially exhausted, administratively strained, and surrounded by enemies. The Angevin Empire that had once seemed invincible was reduced to defending its core territories against an increasingly powerful French monarchy. Yet Richard's reign had profound consequences for English identity. His crusading exploits, however costly, established England as a major player in European affairs and created a romantic image of English kingship that would inspire future generations. The idea of the warrior king, fighting for God and glory, regardless of cost, became embedded in English royal mythology. The administrative innovations forced by Richard's absence also strengthened English government. The justiciar system, the exchequer operations, the common law courts all developed greater independence and efficiency when operating without direct royal supervision. England was becoming a state that could function effectively even when its king was elsewhere. Richard's neglect of England also had an unexpected benefit. It allowed English institutions to develop without excessive royal interference. Common law, the administrative system, and local government all evolved. During his reign, without the heavy-handed royal direction that characterized his father's rule, in absence, Richard inadvertently fostered English constitutional development. The legend of Richard the Lionheart would far outlast the reality of his reign. Future English kings would measure themselves against his crusading ideal, often with disastrous results. The romantic image of the absent hero king, fighting for God and glory while trusted ministers governed at home, became a persistent theme in English royal mythology. But the immediate legacy was more prosaic: a bankrupt treasury, an angry nobility, and a formidable enemy in the form of Philip Augustus of France. The kingdom that John inherited in 1199 faced challenges that would test whether the Angevin Empire could survive under a king who lacked his brother's military reputation but possessed his family's talent for making enemies. The reign of King John, which began in 1199, would prove to be one of the most consequential in English history, not for its successes, but for its failures. The youngest son of Henry II inherited an empire in crisis, and a treasury emptied by his brother's crusading adventures. Within 17 years, John would lose most of his French territories, face excommunication by the Pope, and be forced to accept the most significant limitation on royal power in medieval Europe. John's claim to the throne was immediately contested by his nephew Arthur of Brittany, son of his deceased brother Geoffrey. Arthur's supporters argued that the principle of primogeniture made him the rightful heir, while John claimed the throne through his brother Richard's deathbed designation. This succession dispute would provide Philip Augustus of France with the perfect excuse to dismember the Angevin Empire. The early years of John's reign revealed both his political cunning and his fundamental character flaws. He successfully outmaneuvered Arthur's supporters and secured recognition from most of his barons. But his treatment of prisoners and his notorious cruelty began to alienate potential allies. The mysterious disappearance of Arthur in 1203, almost certainly on John's orders, shocked medieval sensibilities and provided powerful propaganda for his enemies. Philip Augustus proved a far more formidable opponent than John's predecessors had faced. Where earlier French kings had been weak and divided, Philip was calculating, patient, and utterly ruthless in his determination to expel the English from France. His systematic conquest of Normandy between 1202 and 1204 represented one of the most brilliant military campaigns of the medieval period. The fall of Château Galliard in 1204 symbolized the collapse of the Angevin Empire. Richard's supposedly impregnable fortress fell to Philip's engineers after a siege that demonstrated the growing sophistication of medieval warfare. With Normandy lost, John's remaining French territories became impossible to defend. By 1205, the Angevin Empire had shrunk to little more than Gascony and Poitou. John's response to military humiliation was characteristic. He blamed everyone except himself and began planning grandiose schemes for reconquest that bore no relation to England's actual capabilities. The enormous taxes he imposed to fund these phantom campaigns provoked growing resentment among nobles, who saw their wealth squandered on doomed expeditions to recover territories that most of them had never seen. The dispute with Pope Innocent III over the appointment of Stephen Langton as Archbishop of Canterbury in 1206 opened a new front in John's war against his own authority. When John refused to accept Langton, Innocent placed England under interdict, suspending most religious services throughout the kingdom. This was spiritual warfare of unprecedented intensity, designed to turn John's own subjects against him. John's excommunication in 1209 completed his isolation from Christendom. The Pope declared his subjects released from their oaths of allegiance and invited foreign princes to depose him. Philip Augustus began assembling an invasion fleet, while John's own nobles questioned whether they owed loyalty to an excommunicated king. The kingdom that had dominated Europe under Henry II was now a pariah state. The king's surrender to the Pope in 1213 was one of the most humiliating capitulations in English history. John not only accepted Stephen Langton as archbishop, but declared England and Ireland to be fiefs of the papacy, agreeing to pay annual tribute to Rome. This submission saved him from invasion, but destroyed what remained of his credibility with the English nobility. The disastrous Battle of Bouvines in 1214 ended John's last hope of recovering his French territories. His coalition with the Holy Roman Emperor and the Count of Flanders was crushed by Philip Augustus in a battle that established France as the dominant European power. John's allies were captured or killed, his treasury was emptied, and his military reputation was ruined beyond repair. The baronial rebellion that began in 1215 was fueled by more than one. Political grievances represented a fundamental constitutional crisis over the nature of royal authority, led by Stephen Langton and supported by the Church. The rebel barons demanded written guarantees that the king would govern according to law rather than personal whim. This was revolution disguised as restoration. The meeting at Runnymede on June 15, 1215, has become one of the most celebrated events in constitutional history, but the reality was less noble than the legend suggests. Magna Carta was not a democratic manifesto, but a feudal contract designed to protect baronial privileges. Yet its principles that the king was subject to law, that taxation required consent, and that justice could not be sold or denied, would reshape the relationship between ruler and ruled. John's immediate repudiation of Magna Carta plunged England into civil war. The king who had sealed the charter never intended to honor it, viewing the whole exercise as a tactical retreat to buy time for military preparations. His importation of foreign mercenaries and his alliance with papal legates against his own nobles demonstrated his utter contempt for the constitutional limits that had been imposed upon him. The First Barons' War transformed from a domestic rebellion into an international conflict. When the rebels invited Prince Louis of France to claim the English throne, Louis's invasion in 1216 was welcomed by much of the English nobility, who preferred a foreign king to their own tyrant. John found himself controlling little more than the western counties, while French troops occupied London and the southeast. The death of King John at Newark Castle in October 1216, possibly from dysentery, saved England from complete conquest. Had he lived longer, the kingdom might have passed permanently to the French crown. His death allowed the Loyalist Party to rally around his 9-year-old son Henry, transforming the conflict from rebellion against a hated king into resistance against foreign invasion. The regency established for the young Henry III under William Marshal, the most respected knight in England, immediately reissued Magna Carta with modifications. This brilliant stroke transformed the constitutional document from a revolutionary manifesto into a royal grant, establishing the precedent that English kings ruled by consent rather than conquest alone. John's legacy was profound precisely because of his failures. His loss of Normandy ended the dual monarchy that had dominated English politics since 1066, forcing future English kings to focus on their island kingdom rather than continental adventures. His conflicts with the Church established the principle that royal authority was limited by divine law as interpreted by ecclesiastical courts. Most importantly, John's acceptance of Magna Carta, however reluctant and temporary, established constitutional monarchy as the English ideal. Future kings might ignore or circumvent these limitations, but they could never again claim to rule by divine right alone. The principle that government required the consent of the governed had been written into English law. The England that emerged from John's catastrophic reign was smaller, poorer, and more isolated than the Angevin Empire at its height. But it was also more unified, more conscious of its separate identity, and more committed to the idea that royal power should be exercised within legal constraints. The disasters of John's reign had inadvertently created the foundations of constitutional government that would become England's greatest export to the world. The 9-year-old boy who became Henry III in 1216 inherited a kingdom torn apart by civil war, invaded by foreign armies, and governed by a revolutionary charter that his father had died trying to overthrow. Yet from this seemingly hopeless situation would emerge the longest reign in medieval English history and the consolidation of constitutional monarchy as the defining characteristic of English government. The regency of William Marshal, the greatest knight of his age, saved both the kingdom and the monarchy. Marshal's immediate reissue of Magna Carta, modified to remove its more radical provisions, transformed the document from a revolutionary manifesto into a royal grant. This brilliant political maneuver allowed the Loyalists to present themselves as the true defenders of English law against French invasion. The Battle of Lincoln in 1217 marked the turning point in the First Barons' War. Marshal, though nearly 70 years old, personally led the charge that shattered the rebel army and captured their French allies. The victory demonstrated that English resistance to foreign domination remained formidable, even under a child king and a regency government. The naval victory at Sandwich later that year completed the expulsion of Prince Louis and his French supporters. For the first time in English history, sea power had proved decisive in defending the realm. The English fleet that destroyed the French invasion force established naval warfare as a crucial element of national defense, foreshadowing England's later maritime dominance. Henry's personal rule, which began in 1227, revealed a king whose talents lay in art and architecture rather than warfare and politics. His rebuilding of Westminster Abbey created one of the masterpieces of Gothic architecture. While his patronage of scholars and artists made his court a center of European culture, these achievements came at enormous cost to the royal treasury and the patience of his nobles. The king's disastrous expedition to France in 1230, intended to recover his lost inheritance, ended in humiliating retreat and demonstrated that the military weakness that had characterized John's reign persisted under his son. Henry's failure to reconquer Normandy or Poitou forced England to accept its reduced status as an island kingdom rather than a continental empire. Henry's marriage to Eleanor of Provence in 1236 brought new foreign influences to the English court that gradually alienated the native nobility. The Queen's relatives, the Savoyards, received lands, titles, and positions that English nobles felt should have been theirs. This resentment was compounded when Henry's half-brothers, the Lusignans, arrived from France and were similarly rewarded. The Sicilian affair of the 1250s epitomized Henry's political incompetence and financial irresponsibility. His acceptance of the Pope's offer of the crown of Sicily for his son Edmund committed England to an impossible military campaign and enormous financial obligations. When Parliament refused to fund this adventure, Henry was forced to pawn the crown jewels and borrow money at ruinous rates. The growing power of Parliament, during Henry's reign represented a constitutional revolution as significant as Magna Carta itself. The king's constant need for money to fund his projects forced him to summon assemblies of nobles, clergy, and eventually representatives of the towns and counties. What began as a royal expedient evolved into an institution that claimed the right to control royal policy. Simon de Montfort's emergence as leader of the baronial opposition transformed discontent into revolution. Montfort, Henry's brother-in-law and formerly one of his closest allies, possessed the military skill and political vision that the king lacked. His alliance with the church, the towns, and the lesser nobility created a coalition that challenged not just royal policy, but royal authority itself. The provisions of Oxford in 1258 imposed unprecedented limitations on royal power. A council of 15 barons was given authority over all major appointments and policies, effectively reducing Henry to a figurehead. This was constitutional monarchy carried to its logical extreme, a king who reigned but did not rule. Constrained by institutions that claimed to represent the community of the realm, Henry's attempt to escape these constraints by securing papal absolution from his oaths triggered the Second Barons' War in 1264. The conflict that followed was not merely a rebellion, but a civil war over the fundamental nature of government. Montfort's supporters argued that the king should govern through Parliament, while Henry's party maintained that royal authority came from God alone. The Battle of Lewes in 1264 resulted in the complete victory of the parliamentary party and the capture of King Henry and his son Edward. For the first time in English history, a king was held prisoner by his own subjects and forced to govern according to their will. Montfort's Parliament of 1265, which included representatives from towns and counties as well as nobles and clergy, established the precedent for representative government. Yet Montfort's revolution contained the seeds of its own destruction. His reliance on popular support alienated the great nobles. While his authoritarian methods contradicted his democratic rhetoric, when Prince Edward escaped from captivity and raised the royal standard, many who had supported reform abandoned the revolutionary cause. The Battle of Evesham in 1265 ended both Montfort's life and his political experiment. Edward's tactical brilliance and Montfort's political isolation combined to produce a royalist victory that seemed to restore absolute monarchy. Yet the ideas that had driven the revolution, that government required consent, that taxation needed parliamentary approval, and that the king was subject to law, had taken root too deeply to be eradicated. Henry's final years were marked by reconciliation and constitutional compromise. The Statute of Marlborough in 1267 confirmed many of the reforms that Montfort had championed while restoring royal authority within legal limits. The king, who had once claimed to rule by divine right alone, now governed through institutions that represented the community of the realm. The emergence of Edward as the dominant figure in government during the 1270s demonstrated how the constitutional crisis had strengthened, rather than weakened, the monarchy. The future Edward I possessed both the military skills that his father lacked and the political wisdom to work within the parliamentary framework that had evolved during the baronial wars. Henry's death in 1272 marked the end of an era in which the fundamental questions of English government had been debated in Parliament and decided on the battlefield. The constitutional principles established during his reign, that the king ruled through law, that taxation required consent, and that government needed the support of the governed, would become the foundation of the English political system. The 56-year reign that had begun with a child king, accepting constitutional limitations, ended with those limitations embedded in English law and custom. Henry III had inadvertently presided over the creation of parliamentary government, not through his wisdom, but through his weakness. His failures had forced the evolution of institutions that would make England the birthplace of constitutional democracy. The kingdom that Edward I inherited in 1272 was smaller and poorer than the Angevin Empire at its height. But it was also more unified and more committed to the principle of government by consent. The disasters and conflicts of Henry's reign had forged a political system that balanced royal authority with parliamentary oversight, creating the framework for England's future greatness. The coronation of Edward I in 1272 marked the beginning of one of the most transformative reigns in English history, known as Longshanks for his imposing height and the Hammer of the Scots for his ruthless campaigns. Edward would forge modern England through conquest, legal reform, and the systematic expansion of royal authority. Yet his greatest achievement would be the creation of a partnership between Crown and Parliament that made England the most effectively governed kingdom in Europe. Edward's inheritance included not just the English throne, but the constitutional framework that had evolved during his father's troubled reign. Unlike Henry III, who had resented parliamentary limitations on royal power, Edward embraced Parliament as a tool of government. His genius lay in recognizing that consultation strengthened rather than weakened royal authority by ensuring that the Crown's policies had popular support. The conquest of Wales between 1277 and 1284 demonstrated Edward's military brilliance and his understanding of the new realities of medieval warfare. Where previous English kings had attempted to subdue Wales through traditional feudal levies, Edward employed professional soldiers, sophisticated siege engines, and systematic castle building to achieve permanent conquest. The great fortresses of Caernarfon, Conwy, and Harlech announced English dominance in stone and steel. The death of Llewellyn, the last at Chilmary in 1282, ended Welsh independence, but also created a martyr. Memory would inspire resistance for centuries. Edward's decision to present his infant son as Prince of Wales at Caernarfon Castle in 1284 was a masterstroke of propaganda symbolically uniting the English and Welsh crowns. While establishing a new title for the heir to the English throne, Edward's legal reforms transformed English law from a collection of local customs into a coherent national system. The Statute of Westminster in 1275 established standardized procedures for civil litigation, while the Statute of Merchants created commercial courts that made England the most business-friendly kingdom in Europe. These innovations attracted trade and investment while strengthening royal control over legal proceedings. The expulsion of the Jews in 1290 was both a financial expedient and a religious gesture that reflected the growing intolerance of medieval Christianity. Edward's seizure of Jewish property and his cancellation of debts owed to Jewish moneylenders temporarily eased the Crown's financial problems while appealing to popular prejudice. Yet this act of ethnic cleansing also eliminated the kingdom. This most skilled financiers and weakened England's commercial development. Edward's intervention in Scottish affairs began innocently enough with his arbitration of the succession dispute following the death of Alexander III in 1286. His selection of John Balliol as king seemed to settle the matter peacefully, but Edward's subsequent demands for feudal homage transformed arbitration into conquest. The Scottish Wars of Independence that followed would consume the rest of his reign and define Anglo-Scottish relations for centuries. The Sack of Berwick in 1296 announced Edward's determination to treat Scotland as a conquered province rather than a vassal kingdom. The massacre of the town's population shocked medieval sensibilities, but also demonstrated the consequences of resisting English authority. Edward's removal of the Stone of Destiny from Scone to Westminster symbolized his intention to absorb Scotland completely into his expanding realm. The emergence of William Wallace as leader of Scottish resistance in 1297 transformed a feudal rebellion into a national uprising. Wallace's victory at Stirling Bridge demonstrated that English military superiority was not absolute, and that popular resistance could defeat professional armies. His guerrilla campaign forced Edward to commit enormous resources to a war that was supposed to have ended with Balliol's submission. Edward's victory at Falkirk in 1298 restored English military prestige but could not end Scottish resistance. Wallace's tactical innovations, using schiltrons of spearmen to break cavalry charges, influenced military development throughout Europe. Though Wallace was eventually captured and executed with brutal ceremony in 1305, his example inspired a new generation of Scottish leaders. The rebellion of Robert the Bruce in 1306 presented Edward with his most formidable opponent. Bruce combined Wallace's popular appeal with the political legitimacy of royal blood and the military skills of a trained knight. His coronation at Scone directly challenged Edward's authority and transformed the Scottish conflict from rebellion into a war between rival kingdoms. Edward's final campaign in 1307 ended not with victory, but with his death at Berg by Sands, within sight of the Scottish border he had tried so hard to eliminate. His last instructions to his son to boil his bones and carry them on future Scottish campaigns epitomized his obsessive determination to complete the conquests that had eluded him. The Model Parliament of 1295 established the principle that extraordinary taxation required the consent of representatives from every level of society. Edward's famous declaration that what touches all should be approved by all became the foundation of parliamentary democracy. His recognition that effective government required popular support created an institution that would outlast the medieval monarchy itself. Edward's administrative innovations transformed England into the most efficiently governed kingdom in Europe. The chancery rolls, patent rolls, and close rolls created a bureaucratic system that recorded every royal action and established precedents for future administration. His paperwork revolution made royal government more consistent and predictable while creating the records that allow historians to understand medieval England in unprecedented detail. The king's relationship with the church reflected his broader approach to governance: cooperation where possible, coercion where necessary. His support for ecclesiastical reform earned papal approval, while his assertion of royal rights over clerical taxation demonstrated that even the church was subject to royal authority. The balance he struck between spiritual and temporal power became a model for other European monarchs. Edward's economic policies encouraged trade and urban development while strengthening royal finances. His currency reforms established English silver as the standard for northern European commerce, while his trade agreements with Flemish cities created new markets for English wool. The prosperity that followed funded his military campaigns and legal reforms, while establishing England as a commercial power. The reign that ended with Edward's death in 1307 had transformed England from a feudal kingdom into a modern state. His legal codes provided the framework for English common law. His military innovations established new standards for medieval warfare, and his parliamentary institutions created the foundation for representative government. Yet his failure to complete the conquest of Scotland left his son with an unfinished war that would dominate the next reign. Edward II inherited not just a kingdom, but a system of government that depended on the monarch's personal abilities for its effectiveness. The institutions that had served his father so well, Parliament, the law courts, the administrative bureaucracy, required strong royal leadership to function properly. The tragedy of the next reign would demonstrate what happened when institutional strength could not compensate for royal weakness. The reign of Edward II, which began in 1307, would prove that even the most sophisticated governmental machinery could not compensate for weak leadership at the top. The son who inherited Edward I's throne possessed none of his father's political skills, military abilities, or popular appeal. Within 20 years, the kingdom that had dominated Britain under the hammer of the Scots would face military humiliation, political revolution, and ultimately regicide. Edward II's obsession with his favorite peers, Gaveston, immediately alienated the English nobility and demonstrated his fundamental unfitness for medieval kingship. In an age when personal relationships were political statements, the king's public devotion to a Gascon knight of modest birth appeared to threaten the natural order of society. The barons who had cooperated with Edward I found themselves excluded from influence by a royal favorite who mocked their traditions and monopolized the king's attention. The Lords Ordainers, led by Edward's own cousin Thomas of Lancaster, imposed constitutional limitations on royal power that went far beyond even Magna Carta. The ordinances of 1311 required parliamentary approval for declarations of war, the appointment of officials, and departures from the kingdom. For the first time in English history, a king was reduced to a constitutional figurehead, stripped of the executive powers that defined medieval monarchy. The murder of Piers Gaveston in 1312, executed by noble conspirators who had seized him while under royal protection, marked a point of no return in Edward's relationship with his nobility. The king's hysterical grief and his vows of vengeance revealed the emotional instability that made him incapable of the political calculation that successful kingship required. England had become ungovernable because its king was ungoverned. The Scottish campaign of 1314 offered Edward a chance to restore his military reputation and unite his fractured kingdom behind a common cause. Robert the Bruce's siege of Stirling Castle, the last major English stronghold in Scotland, seemed to present the perfect opportunity for a decisive victory that would complete his father's unfinished conquest and silence his domestic critics. The Battle of Bannockburn on June 24, 1314, became one of the most catastrophic defeats in English military history. Edward's army, larger and better equipped than the Scottish forces, was routed by Bruce's tactical brilliance and the king's own incompetence. The flower of English chivalry perished in the Scottish Chilterns, while Edward himself fled the field in panic, abandoning his army and his royal seal. The aftermath of Bannockburn transformed the balance of power throughout the British Isles. Scottish independence was effectively secured. English prestige was shattered, and Edward's authority was fatally compromised. The king who had promised to complete his father's conquests had instead legitimized Scottish resistance and established Robert the Bruce as one of Europe's premier military commanders. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322, triggered by catastrophic harvests across northern Europe, coincided with Scotland's systematic devastation of northern England. Bruce's raids, penetrating as far south as Yorkshire, demonstrated English military helplessness. While the kingdom struggled with starvation and social collapse, the prosperity that had characterized Edward I's reign gave way to misery that seemed to reflect divine displeasure with Edward II's rule. The emergence of Hugh Despenser, the Younger, as Edward's new favorite, repeated the pattern that had led to Gaveston's murder, but with even more destructive consequences. The Despensers, father and son, possessed political ambitions that far exceeded Gaveston's personal greed. Their systematic acquisition of lands and titles in Wales and the Welsh borders created a regional power base that threatened to reduce England to a collection of private fiefdoms. The civil war that erupted in 1321 was fundamentally different from earlier baronial rebellions, where previous conflicts had sought to limit royal power within existing institutions. This uprising aimed at the complete destruction of the Despenser regime. Thomas of Lancaster, in alliance with the Welsh marcher lords, created a coalition that controlled much of England and openly defied royal authority. Edward's victory at Boroughbridge in 1322 and the subsequent execution of Thomas of Lancaster temporarily restored royal power, but at the cost of making the king dependent on Despenser ruthlessness. The systematic persecution of Lancaster's supporters, the confiscation of their lands, and the use of torture to extract confessions created a reign of terror that destroyed what remained of Edward's legitimacy. The invasion of Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer in 1326 was welcomed by an English population exhausted by misgovernment and civil war. Isabella's claim to be liberating England from the Despenser tyranny resonated with nobles and commons alike, while her alliance with the Count of Hennelet provided the military support necessary to challenge Edward's regime. The rapid collapse of Edward's government demonstrated how completely he had alienated his subjects. Town after town opened its gates to Isabella's forces, while the king's supporters melted away or actively joined the rebellion. The flight of Edward and Hugh Despenser to Wales marked the effective end of a reign that had brought England nothing but humiliation and suffering. The capture of Edward II in November 1326 posed an unprecedented constitutional problem. What to do with a king who was still alive but completely unfit to rule? Medieval political theory provided no mechanism for deposing an anointed monarch. Yet continuing Edward's reign was clearly impossible. The solution would establish dangerous precedents for future royal depositions. The Parliament of 1327 that formally deposed Edward II was revolutionary in both its composition and its actions. For the first time, representatives of the commons participated in the removal of a king, establishing the principle that royal authority derived from popular consent rather than divine appointment alone. The elaborate legal fiction that Edward had abdicated voluntarily could not disguise the reality that Parliament had assumed the power to make and unmake kings. The installation of the 14-year-old Edward III under the regency of Isabella and Mortimer temporarily stabilized English government, but created new problems for the future. The precedent of successful rebellion against royal authority, the example of regicide, and the demonstration that Parliament could depose kings would inspire future challenges to royal power. The constitutional revolution of 1327 would echo through English history for centuries. The murder of Edward II at Berkeley Castle in September 1327, almost certainly ordered by Mortimer to eliminate the possibility of restoration, removed the immediate political threat, but created a martyr whose cult would embarrass his successors. The grotesque method of execution, reportedly involving a red-hot poker, reflected the sexual scandals that had characterized his reign, while ensuring that his death would be remembered as uniquely horrific. The reign that had begun with such promise in 1307 ended with regicide, foreign domination, and constitutional revolution. Edward II's personal failings had not merely damaged his own reputation, but had called into question the very foundations of medieval monarchy. The principle of divine right had been shattered by a king whose behavior seemed to contradict every ideal of royal leadership. Yet from this catastrophe would emerge one of England's greatest monarchs. Edward III, schooled by his father's failures and his mother's ambitions, would restore English military prestige, reassert royal authority, and launch the wars that would define the late medieval period. The disasters of Edward II's reign became the foundation for his son's triumphs, proving that even the most catastrophic failures could serve as lessons for future greatness. The 14-year-old boy who became Edward III in 1327 inherited a kingdom humiliated by military defeat, traumatized by regicide, and dominated by his mother Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer. Yet within 50 years, this unlikely king would transform England into the dominant military power in Europe and establish the English monarchy as the most successful warrior dynasty of the medieval world. Edward's early years under the regency revealed both his political intelligence and his determination to escape the control of those who had placed him on the throne. While outwardly deferential to Isabella and Mortimer, he quietly built a network of young nobles who shared his resentment of the regime that had murdered his father and usurped royal authority. The coup of 1330 that overthrew Mortimer demonstrated Edward's precocious political skills and his understanding that successful kingship required dramatic gestures. The midnight arrest of Mortimer at Nottingham Castle, accomplished through a secret tunnel while Isabella pleaded for her lover's life, announced that England once again had a king who would not be controlled by others. Execution and Isabella's retirement to comfortable exile marked the beginning of Edward's personal rule and the restoration of royal authority after years of regency government. The young king's clemency toward his mother, despite her role in his father's murder, showed a political maturity that surprised his contemporaries and established his reputation for magnanimity. Edward's decision to renew the war with Scotland in 1332 reflected both personal ambition and political necessity. The humiliation of Bannockburn haunted English military prestige, while the border raids that had characterized Robert the Bruce's reign continued under his son David II. Edward's support for Edward Balliol's claim to the Scottish throne provided the legal pretext for intervention. The Battle of Halidon Hill in 1333 marked Edward's emergence as a military commander of genius and announced the tactical revolution that would dominate the remainder of the medieval period. His deployment of dismounted men-at-arms, supported by massed longbowmen, shattered the Scottish schiltrons that had triumphed at Bannockburn, establishing a tactical system that would prove devastating against continental opponents. The innovation of the English longbow represented more than a technological advance, embodied a social revolution that democratized medieval warfare, where traditional armies depended on aristocratic heavy cavalry. Edward's forces relied on English and Welsh peasants whose skill with the bow made them the most feared soldiers in Europe. This tactical democratization would have profound implications for English society. Edward's claim to the French throne in 1337, based on his descent from Philip IV through his mother Isabella, transformed a dynastic dispute into the 100 Years' War. While his legal case was weak, the French had excluded female inheritance to prevent English rule. His military capabilities made his claim credible. The war that followed would define both English and French national identity. The naval victory at Sluys in 1340 established English control of the English Channel and demonstrated Edward's understanding that naval power was essential to continental warfare. The destruction of the French fleet not only secured English communications with Flanders, but also announced that England had become a maritime power capable of projecting force across northern Europe. The Siege of Calais from 1346 to 1347 epitomized Edward's strategic vision and his determination to establish permanent English bases on the continent. The capture of this vital port provided England with a secure foothold in France and a base for future operations. More importantly, the heroic resistance of the townspeople and Edward's eventual mercy toward them enhanced his reputation for chivalric behavior. The Battle of Inn 1346 became the defining moment of Edward, his military career, and the tactical model for English warfare for the next century. His devastating defeat of Philip VI's army, achieved through superior tactics rather than numerical superiority, established the English military reputation that would dominate European battlefields until the rise of professional armies. The emergence of the Black Prince as Edward's military heir added another dimension to English military prestige. The prince's victory at Poitiers in 1356, where he captured the French King John II, surpassed even his father's achievements, and established the Plantagenet dynasty as the premier warrior house of Europe. The spectacle of the French king dining as the Black Prince's prisoner symbolized English military dominance. The Treaty of 1360 represented the height of English success in the Hundred Years' War and established Edward as the most powerful monarch in Western Europe. The acquisition of Aquitaine in full sovereignty, combined with the retention of Calais and the payment of an enormous ransom for King John, transformed England from an island kingdom into a continental empire. Edward's creation of the Order of the Garter, around 1348, reflected his understanding that military success required social cohesion among the aristocratic elite. This chivalric order, modeled on Arthurian legend, bound the greatest nobles of England to the crown through bonds of honor that transcended mere feudal obligation. The Garter became the symbol of English noble identity. The Black Death that struck England in 1348-1349 killed perhaps a third of the population and transformed English society more profoundly than any military victory. The massive mortality created labor shortages that empowered surviving peasants while weakening traditional social hierarchies. Edward's government struggled to maintain pre-plague wage levels through legislation that proved impossible to enforce. The Good Parliament of 1376 marked the beginning of constitutional challenges to royal authority that would define the late medieval period. The Commons' impeachment of royal ministers and their demands for financial accountability demonstrated that parliamentary power had evolved far beyond its origins as a royal tool for raising taxes. Edward's acquiescence in these proceedings showed his recognition that even successful kings must govern through consent. The death of the Black Prince in 1376 deprived Edward of his designated successor and created a succession crisis that would plague the realm for decades. The elevation of the prince's 10-year-old son, the future Richard II, over Edward's surviving sons established the principle of primogeniture, but also ensured another minority reign with all its attendant problems. Edward's final years were marked by military reversals in France, financial difficulties at home, and growing criticism of his government's effectiveness. The French revival under Charles V systematically reconquered most of Edward's continental gains, while Parliament increasingly challenged royal expenditure and demanded accountability from royal officials. The death of Edward III in 1377 ended one of the most successful reigns in English history, but it also marked the beginning of a new phase in which military glory could no longer compensate for domestic problems. The kingdom that Richard II inherited was militarily dominant but socially unstable. It's financially strained and constitutionally uncertain. Edward's legacy was transformative. He had restored English military prestige, established parliamentary government as a permanent feature of English politics, and created the social and economic conditions that would drive English expansion for centuries. Yet his very success had raised expectations that his successors would struggle to meet, setting the stage for the conflicts that would dominate the late medieval period. The 50-year reign that had begun with a traumatized boy king ended with England as the dominant military power in Western Europe. Edward III had not merely restored the monarchy's reputation, he had transformed England into a warrior nation whose military culture would shape its identity for centuries to come. The coronation of Richard II in 1377 brought a 10-year-old boy to the throne of a kingdom transformed by plague, war, and social upheaval. The England that the young king inherited was militarily dominant but internally fractured, its traditional social order shattered by the Black Death, and its political system challenged by an increasingly assertive parliament. Richard's reign would test whether medieval monarchy could adapt to these new realities or be destroyed by them. The regency government established for the young king reflected the constitutional developments of Edward III's later years. With power shared between the royal council and parliament rather than concentrated in a single regent, this arrangement satisfied political theorists, but created practical problems. As competing factions used the king's minority to advance their own interests, while neglecting the urgent problems facing the realm. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 erupted with a violence that shocked the medieval world and demonstrated how completely the Black Death had transformed English society. The poll tax that triggered the uprising was merely the spark that ignited decades of resentment. Among peasants who had seen their economic position improve dramatically, but found themselves still bound by legal obligations that no longer reflected economic reality. What Tyler's March on London brought perhaps 60,000 rebels to the capital, representing the largest popular uprising in English history. The rebels' demands the abolition of serfdom, the limitation of rents, and the punishment of corrupt officials challenged the fundamental assumptions of feudal society. Their systematic destruction of legal records demonstrated their understanding that social revolution required the elimination of the documents that enforced their subjugation. Richard's personal intervention at Smithfield, where he faced the rebel army after Tyler's death, revealed both his political courage and his instinctive understanding of royal theater. His declaration that "I will be your king, your captain, and your leader" temporarily diffused the crisis and allowed government forces to disperse the rebels peacefully rather than through massacre. The savage repression that followed the revolt's collapse demonstrated the limits of royal mercy when fundamental social order was threatened. Richard's repudiation of his promises to the rebels and the systematic execution of their leaders established the principle that royal authority could not be constrained by concessions made under duress. But it also stored up resentment that would influence future social conflicts. Richard's assertion of personal rule in 1389 marked his emergence as a king determined to govern without the constitutional limitations that had constrained his minority. His belief in absolute monarchy, influenced by continental theories of divine right, brought him into direct conflict with English traditions of parliamentary government and aristocratic consultation that had evolved over centuries. The king's cultivation of a court culture that emphasized royal magnificence and artistic patronage reflected his vision of monarchy as an almost sacred institution, elevated above ordinary political concerns. The rebuilding of Westminster Hall, with its revolutionary hammer-beam roof, created a throne room worthy of an emperor, while his patronage of Geoffrey Chaucer and other poets established his court as a center of literary achievement. Richard's obsession with the murder of his grandfather and his determination to avenge Edward II created a dangerous fixation on past wrongs that distorted his political judgment. His systematic persecution of the families involved in the 1327 deposition revealed a vindictive streak that alienated potential supporters and convinced many nobles that their own safety required the king's removal. The Lords Appellant crisis of 1387-1388 demonstrated that Richard's assertion of absolute authority had fatally weakened his political position. The coalition of nobles led by his uncle Thomas of Woodstock successfully challenged royal policy in Parliament and forced the execution of the king's closest advisors. The merciless Parliament that followed established precedents for aristocratic control over royal government. Richard's revenge against the Lords Appellant in 1397 to 1399 showed both his political cunning and his fundamental misunderstanding of English political culture. His systematic arrest and elimination of his former opponents, accomplished through legal processes that appeared constitutional, demonstrated his tactical skills but also revealed his inability to distinguish between tactical victory and strategic success. The exile of Henry Bolingbroke in 1398 and the subsequent seizure of his Lancastrian inheritance, when John of Gaunt died in 1399, represented Richard's fatal miscalculation. By attacking the property rights that formed the foundation of aristocratic power, the king united his enemies and provided them with a cause that resonated throughout English society. Henry's invasion in 1399 was welcomed by an English nobility, convinced that Richard's rule had become both tyrannical and incompetent. The rapid collapse of royal resistance demonstrated how completely the king had alienated his natural supporters. While Henry's careful emphasis on his claim to the Lancastrian inheritance rather than the throne itself initially made his rebellion appear defensive rather than revolutionary, the deposition of Richard II in September 1399 followed the precedent established by his great-grandfather's removal in 1327, but was accomplished with far greater constitutional sophistication. the elaborate parliamentary proceedings that justified Henry's usurpation created legal precedents for limiting royal power while establishing the principle that bad kings could be legitimately removed by their subjects. Richard's murder at Pontefract Castle in early 1400, almost certainly ordered by Henry IV to eliminate the possibility of restoration, followed the pattern established by Edward II's fate, but created new problems for the usurping dynasty. The cult that developed around the dead king's memory provided a rallying point for opposition to Lancastrian rule and established dangerous precedents for political martyrdom. The reign that had begun with such promise ended in regicide and usurpation. But Richard's failures had inadvertently advanced English constitutional development. His attempts to establish absolute monarchy had provoked reactions that strengthened parliamentary government and aristocratic rights, while his deposition established the principle that royal authority was conditional rather than absolute. Henry IV's succession marked the beginning of Lancastrian rule, but also created constitutional problems that would plague England for decades. His usurpation of the throne, however legally justified, had violated the principle of hereditary succession and established the dangerous precedent that successful rebellion could legitimize dynastic change. The Wars of the Roses that would eventually tear England apart had their origins in Richard S's deposition and Henry S. usurpation. The constitutional crisis of 1399 had demonstrated that English kings ruled by consent rather than divine right alone. But it had also shown that this consent could be withdrawn through violence when political mechanisms failed. Richard II's tragic reign revealed both the potential and the limitations of medieval monarchy. His artistic patronage and cultural achievements showed what royal authority could accomplish when directed toward creative ends, while his political failures demonstrated the catastrophic consequences of attempting to govern without regard for English constitutional traditions. The England that emerged from Richard S.'s reign was forever changed by the experience of deposing and murdering an anointed king. The sacredness of monarchy had been permanently compromised, while the power of Parliament and the nobility to constrain royal authority had been dramatically demonstrated. These changes would shape English political development for centuries to come. The usurpation of Henry IV in 1399 marked the beginning of a new dynasty, but it also unleashed forces that would tear England apart for the next century. The Lancastrian kings, who ruled from 1399 to 1461, would face constant challenges to their legitimacy, devastating wars in France, and ultimately civil conflict that would destroy the very foundations of medieval monarchy. Their reign would demonstrate that successful rebellion, however justified, inevitably created precedents for future revolution. Henry IV's early years were dominated by rebellions that tested his grip on the throne he had seized. The revolt of Owen Glendower in Wales, beginning in 1400, transformed a local dispute into a national uprising that would rage for 15 years. Glendower's claim to be the true Prince of Wales and his alliance with French and Scottish enemies of England created a three-front war that stretched royal resources to breaking point. The Percy Rebellion of 1403 proved even more dangerous because it came from within the English nobility itself. The family that had helped Henry gain the throne now turned against him, citing his failure to pay promised rewards and his increasingly autocratic rule. The Battle of Shrewsbury, where Henry personally defeated the rebels and killed the famous Hotspur, established his military reputation, but could not eliminate the doubts about his legitimacy. Henry's struggle with chronic illness, possibly leprosy, symbolized the weakness that plagued his entire reign. The king, who had once been the most accomplished knight in England, gradually withdrew from public life, leaving government in the hands of councils that lacked the authority to address the kingdom's mounting problems. His premature aging became a metaphor for the decline of royal prestige. The accession of Henry V in 1413 brought a dramatically different personality to the throne. Where his father had been cautious and defensive, Henry was aggressive and visionary. His decision to renew the war with France was both a response to domestic political pressure and a calculated attempt to unite England behind a common cause that would legitimize Lancastrian rule through military glory. The Agincourt campaign of 1415 represented the last great triumph of English medieval warfare and established Henry as the most successful military commander since Edward III. His devastating victory over a French army that outnumbered his forces by perhaps 4-1 proved that English tactical superiority could still come numerical disadvantage when properly applied. Henry's systematic conquest of Normandy between 1417 and 1419 demonstrated a strategic vision that went far beyond his predecessors' raiding campaigns. His establishment of English settlements, his rebuilding of fortifications, and his creation of an English administration in conquered territories showed his intention to make permanent gains rather than seek temporary military glory. The Treaty of Chiaut in 1420, which recognized Henry as heir to the French throne and regent of France, represented the height of English medieval ambitions. His marriage to Catherine of Valois symbolically united the English and French crowns. While his military control of northern France made his inheritance appear inevitable, England had never been closer to dominating its ancient enemy. Henry's death at Vincennes in 1422, possibly from dysentery, contracted during the Siege of Meaux, demonstrated the fragility of medieval military achievements. The king, who had seemed destined to rule both England and France, died at 35, leaving only an infant son to inherit his conquests. The dual monarchy that had appeared so secure collapsed within a generation. The minority of Henry VI created unprecedented constitutional problems because the infant king was heir to two crowns with competing demands. The regency arrangements that attempted to govern both England and France through councils and appointed lieutenants proved inadequate to the challenges of maintaining conquests that required constant military pressure and diplomatic skill. The emergence of Joan of Arc in 1429 transformed the nature of the Hundred Years' War from a dynastic conflict into a struggle for national survival. Her relief of, and her subsequent victories, convinced many French nobles that God opposed the English occupation, while her capture and execution by the English made her a martyr whose memory would inspire French resistance for generations. The coronation of Charles VII at Reims in 1429, accomplished under Joan's protection, provided France with a legitimate king for the first time since 1420 and began the systematic reconquest of English territories. The French revival, aided by military innovations, including improved artillery and professional armies, gradually eroded the English position in France. Henry VI's assumption of personal rule in 1437 revealed a king whose saintly character was wholly unsuited to the demands of medieval monarchy. His preference for peace over war, his reluctance to execute enemies, and his genuine piety made him beloved by clergy and chroniclers, but despised by nobles who expected their king to lead them to victory and profit. The loss of Normandy in 1450 and Gascony in 1453 ended the English Empire in France and destroyed the military reputation that had sustained English morale for over a century. The final defeat at Castellon, where the last English army in France was destroyed by artillery, marked the end of medieval warfare, and the beginning of a new age in which English victories would depend on naval rather than land power. Henry's periodic bouts of mental illness, beginning with his complete breakdown in 1453, created a power vacuum that his noble relatives rushed to fill. The appointment of Richard, Duke of York, as protector during the king's incapacity provided legal precedent for aristocratic control over royal government, but it also established dangerous precedents for deposing incapacitated monarchs. The First Battle of St. Albans in 1455 marked the beginning of open warfare between the Yorkist and Lancastrian factions, transforming political competition into military conflict. The death of Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, in this skirmish eliminated Henry's most capable supporter and left the field clear for Yorkist ambitions. The Wars of the Roses that followed represented more than a dynastic struggle. They embodied a fundamental crisis of legitimacy that had been building since Henry IV's usurpation. The competing claims of York and Lancaster could not be resolved through legal mechanisms, because both sides questioned the constitutional foundations of their opponent's authority. The deposition of Henry VI in 1461 completed the cycle that had begun with Richard II's removal in 1399. Edward IV's victory at Towton, the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil, established Yorkist rule through military conquest rather than parliamentary approval. The precedent of successful rebellion had finally destroyed the monarchy it was originally intended to reform. The Lancastrian dynasty that had promised to restore legitimate government after Richard II. As tyranny ended with military defeat and royal exile, Their 62 years of rule had witnessed the loss of the French Empire, the breakdown of royal authority, and the beginning of civil wars that would ravage England for decades. Yet the Lancastrian legacy was not entirely negative. Their struggles with legitimacy had strengthened parliamentary institutions. Their military failures had encouraged English maritime development. Their constitutional innovations had established precedents that would influence future political development. The lessons of their failures would prove as valuable as the achievements of their predecessors. The England that passed to Edward IV in 1461 was smaller, poorer, and more divided than the kingdom that Henry IV had seized in 1399. But it was also more experienced in the mechanisms of political change, more conscious of the limitations of royal power, and more committed to the principle that government required popular consent. The disasters of Lancastrian rule had inadvertently prepared England for the transformations that would make it a modern state. The victory of Edward IV at Towton in 1461 seemed to end the Wars of the Roses, but it had actually inaugurated the most violent phase of a conflict that would consume English politics for another quarter century. The House of York would rule England for only 24 years, yet their brief dominance would witness the transformation of medieval monarchy into something recognizably modern, the emergence of new forms of royal power, and ultimately, the rise of a dynasty that would reshape the world. Edward's early reign demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of ruling through military conquest. His victory at Towton had been so complete that organized Lancastrian resistance seemed impossible. Yet his failure to eliminate the surviving claimants ensured that the civil war would continue. The escaped Henry VI, this Queen Margaret of Anjou, and their supporters in Scotland and France provided rallying points for future rebellions. The king's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville in 1464, conducted in secret, and revealed only when Edward was pressed to marry a foreign princess, created a scandal that would haunt his reign. By choosing an English widow of modest birth over a continental alliance, Edward prioritized personal preference over political advantage, alienating his greatest supporter, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, who had negotiated the rejected French marriage. Warwick's rebellion in 1470, which temporarily restored Henry VI to the throne, demonstrated how quickly political fortunes could change in an age of personal monarchy. The man who had been known as the Kingmaker proved that he could unmake kings as easily as he had made them, forcing Edward into exile and creating the bizarre spectacle of a mentally incompetent king restored by his former enemies. Edward's return in 1471 and his victories at Barnet and Tewkesbury eliminated the Lancastrian threat permanently, while establishing new standards for royal ruthlessness. The deaths of Warwick at Barnet, Prince Edward at Tewkesbury, and Henry VI in the Tower of London removed the most dangerous claimants to the throne and demonstrated Edward's understanding that successful usurpation required the elimination of rival bloodlines. The 12 years of peace that followed Edward's final victory allowed him to demonstrate the potential of strong royal government freed from the constraints of civil war. His promotion of trade, his encouragement of urban development, and his systematic rebuilding of royal finances showed how effective monarchy could be when directed toward constructive rather than destructive ends. Edward's use of the printing press, recently introduced to England by William Caxton, represented a revolution in royal communication and propaganda. For the first time, royal proclamations could be mass-produced and distributed throughout the kingdom, while literary works celebrating York's achievements could reach audiences far beyond the court. The written word became a weapon of political control. The king's sudden death in 1483, at only 40 years old, created exactly the succession crisis that his elimination of rival claimants was supposed to prevent. The accession of his 12-year-old son Edward V under the protection of his uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, seemed to promise a smooth transition, but it actually provided the opportunity for the most notorious usurpation in English history. Richard III's seizure of the throne in June 1483, accomplished through a carefully orchestrated campaign that declared his nephews illegitimate and positioned himself as the rightful king, demonstrated the sophistication that political manipulation had reached by the late 15th century. His coronation was technically legal and constitutionally proper, yet it was universally recognized as a transparent usurpation. The disappearance of the princes in the Tower became the defining mystery of Richard's reign, and the source of propaganda that would destroy his reputation for centuries. Whether the young Edward V and his brother were murdered, hidden away, or spirited abroad, their fate became a symbol of Richard's alleged tyranny and provided his enemies with a powerful emotional weapon. Henry Tudor's invasion in 1485 was militarily insignificant, but politically transformative. His tenuous claim to the throne, based on illegitimate descent from John of Gaunt, was strengthened by his promise to marry Elizabeth of York and unite the warring houses. The coalition that supported him included not just Lancastrian loyalists, but Yorkists disgusted by Richard's alleged crimes. The Battle of Bosworth Field on August 22, 1485, lasted only a few hours but changed the course of English history. Richard's death, fighting bravely against overwhelming odds, ended the Plantagenet dynasty that had ruled England for over 3 centuries and brought to power a family that would establish England as a European great power and launch the expansion that would create the British Empire. Henry VII's victory owed more to political calculation than military prowess, but his subsequent reign would prove that he possessed exactly the skills that England needed to recover from decades of civil war. His systematic elimination of potential rivals, his careful rebuilding of royal finances, and his pragmatic foreign policy created the stability that had eluded England since the death of Edward III. The marriage of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York in 1486 symbolically united the Roses of Lancaster and York, while practically ending the dynastic conflicts that had torn England apart. Their children would inherit claims to the throne that no reasonable person could dispute, finally providing England with a royal family whose legitimacy was unquestionable. Henry's creation of new institutions of royal government, including the Court of Star Chamber and the Council learned in the law, established mechanisms for controlling the nobility that were more effective than traditional feudal bonds. These innovations represented the beginning of modern bureaucratic government and the end of the personal monarchy that had characterized the medieval period. The emergence of England as a naval power during Henry's reign laid the foundations for future imperial expansion. His support for explorers like John Cabot, his encouragement of shipbuilding, and his understanding that island nations must control the seas surrounding them established principles that would guide English strategy for centuries. The England that Henry VII bequeathed to his son Henry VIII in 1509 was recognizably the same kingdom that Alfred the Great had defended against the Vikings 6 centuries earlier. Yet it was also fundamentally transformed. The feudal monarchy of the medieval period had given way to bureaucratic absolutism. The warrior culture of the Middle Ages had been replaced by commercial ambition, and the isolated kingdom of the Anglo-Saxons had become a player on the European stage. The great themes that had shaped English development, the tension between royal authority and popular consent, the struggle to balance unity with diversity, the challenge of governing through law rather than force, remained as relevant as ever. But the solutions that future generations would find to these eternal problems would be shaped by the foundations that had been laid over 6 centuries of triumph and disaster. From Alfred's desperate resistance in the Somerset marshes to Henry Tudor's victory at Bosworth Field, the English people had forged a national identity through conquest and resistance, innovation and tradition, success and failure. The kingdom that emerged from this crucible would go on to spread its language, laws, and institutions across the globe, but its character had been formed in the crucible of medieval conflict. The story that began with Anglo-Saxon kings fighting for survival would continue with Tudor monarchs pursuing global dominion. Yet the essential elements of English identity, pragmatic adaptation to changing circumstances, respect for legal precedent, combined with willingness to innovate, and the belief that government should serve the governed rather than the governors, had been established during these formative centuries, when England learned to be English.